When we drew our overview of the autonomic nervous system, we specifically used red and green to draw representative neurons that were leaving the central nervous system or were making synapses. Today, we're going to discuss what the red and green actually mean. So the red and the green refer to neurotransmitters that are produced by these different neurons that are part of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And the story is a little bit complicated, so we really want to break it down into as simplistic a story as we can. So here we're going to draw just a kind of half of the spinal cord, and there's the little central canal there for reference. And since we're on the sympathetic side of things, remember that what we're dealing with is the spinal nerves T1 through L2, all the thoracic neurons and the lumbar. Now that little jut sticking out there is going to be the lateral gray horns, the lateral gray matter, and we're going to be drawing some of our little V's into there representing the dendrites, the somata and dendrites, of course, of the structures in there, and we're going to be sending these first structures out directly into this target tissue, which is the adrenal gland, and specifically the adrenal medulla meaning the middle part. The synaptic connection is directly from the spinal cord, one neuron directly into the medulla, the adrenal medulla. And what we know about the cells in the adrenal medulla is they produce norepinephrine and epinephrine. And as these cells are stimulated by this green neuron, these green neurons, they're going to be producing that norepinephrine and epinephrine and putting it into the blood supply. And I'll just draw little red dots there to represent these neurotransmitters leaving the adrenal medulla and entering the blood supply. Now, just so you know, this particular neuron is still considered a preganglionic neuron. Even though it does not synapse inside of a ganglion, it sends its tendrils directly to the adrenal medulla, it's still considered preganglionic. Now we're going to show another neuron leaving out of that lateral horn, a short little preganglionic neuron, and this, I'm not showing the ganglion here, but there would be a ganglion where this synapse is occurring. Preganglionic neuron synapsing with a postganglionic neuron, which is much longer, and in this case it's targeting the sweat glands. Remember, this was the one exception where you had a green talking to a green and then targeting the sweat glands. And then the last one we're going to draw is where the preganglionic neuron is green and the postganglionic neuron is red. So the exceptions are the adrenal medulla and the sweat glands have sort of special cases, but everything else has a short green preganglionic neuron and a long red postganglionic neuron. All right, so now we're going to draw in what the green and the red actually mean. The green means acetylcholine. These are cholinergic neurons. They are neurons that produce acetylcholine. So our little key that we're setting up here, cholinergic neurons is the word for a neuron that produces and releases at its synaptic cleft acetylcholine. So cholinergic neurons produce acetylcholine, and that is represented by the green. Next up in red is an adrenergic neuron that produces norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is the same as noradrenaline, and these are close cousins to epinephrine / adrenaline. So noradrenaline and norepinephrine are the same thing, and epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. It's worth taking a beat to take a look at this as a whole and think about what the sympathetic nervous system is. The sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is mainly in charge of producing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Other than the sweat glands, which are receiving input from cholinergic neurons, which produce acetylcholine, everything else is actually producing, basically, adrenaline, which is a fairly well-known substance. So let's look at how that appears. If you look at the adrenal medulla, this is receiving cholinergic input from the preganglionic neuron, but the cells inside of the adrenal medulla produce norepinephrine, but more in greater proportion, they produce a great deal of epinephrine or adrenaline. That's actually where the word adrenaline comes from, the adrenal glands. And then the other side of it, when you look up at the top and you talk about a preganglionic neuron that is cholinergic, the postganglionic neuron, which is actually targeting the tissues, produces norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is actually a close molecular, has a close molecular relationship with epinephrine or adrenaline. Adrenaline and epinephrine are fairly well-known substances that accelerate the heart rate, for example, increase blood pressure, open up the airways of the lungs. So in the next video, we'll be talking about what the sympathetic nervous system really is, its characteristics, but I really want you to know the why behind it. So when we look at the neurotransmitters and we look at the neural makeup of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, I want you to keep in mind what these neurotransmitters are, what they do, where they are present, who they target, and then that will start to make sense when we discuss what the sympathetic branch of the ANS does. Let us turn our attention to the parasympathetic side of the ANS. Remember that when we drew this out, there were always two neurons in a row, a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic neuron, and they were all green. So what does the green mean? Well, again, we're looking at neurotransmitters, and the green means the same as it did on the sympathetic side. So you may recall, try to recall it before we draw it out and write it out. What did the green fibers mean? What did a green neuron represent? All right, so let's take a look at our parasympathetic neurotransmitters. At the top, again, I'm going to just draw a horrific version of a brain. Oh my gosh, it's so bad. Anyway, at the top, we're going to have so this is our brain stem itself. And at the top, we're going to be representing the midbrain, and we're going to have a single output from the midbrain. Go ahead and do the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron at once. And the other three outputs I'm going to draw in here, representative neurons leaving the medulla oblongata. Remember that the pons has some role in processing autonomic nervous system, as does the hypothalamus, by the way, which is pretty much in charge. But we don't draw them because we are only interested in the actual specific outputs directly from the brain. So we have four outputs represented here. At the top would be a representation going through cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. Below that would be the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and then below that would be cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then, of course, the one at the bottom, which I'm not even drawing the end to, is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, which actually innervates many, many different parts. It's bilateral. There's two of them. They go down the body cavity. They pretty much effect changes in just about every organ in the ventral body cavity. You'll notice, just as the same with the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm not specifically drawing ganglia, you're just going to have to take it on faith that the ganglia are in fact there and that all these little synaptic connections happen inside of ganglia. Next, we're going to draw a representation of the spinal cord, a cross-section of the spinal cord. There's our little central canal. There's our gray matter, our little lateral horn, a little lateral gray matter. And remember that since it's the parasympathetic nervous system, we are only interested in S2, S3, S4. And in this case, I will only draw one connection, one preganglionic neuron, which is quite long, one postganglionic neuron, which is quite short. And for the sake of the simplicity of here, we'll just say effectors in general. Eyes, salivary glands, the reproductive organs, the digestive tract, all of these are targets of the parasympathetic nervous system. But they're all green, right? So green, you may recall, is cholinergic, releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So the story is fairly straightforward in the parasympathetic nervous system. All of the neurons are cholinergic. However, acetylcholine is not quite as well known as its counterpart, adrenaline and epinephrine. And so we're going to be spending some time talking about the effects of both adrenaline and noradrenaline, but more specifically acetylcholine, because we need to spend some time thinking about what it actually does in the case of the autonomic nervous system.